In the early decades of 19th century America, life was unforgiving for those born without wealth or family connections. Opportunity was rare, and reputation meant everything. For Dorcas Doyen, later known to the world as Helen Jewett, fate dealt its hardest blow early. She lost both parents while still a child in Maine. Overnight, she went from a girl with a family to an orphan with little protection in a society that valued stability above all else. Orphans in that era were often placed in the homes of strangers as servants. Some were fortunate enough to be treated with kindness, but most were seen as little more than cheap labor. Dorcas fell into the latter category, though her intelligence and sharp wit made her stand out. Unlike many children in her position, she was literate and loved to read. Books became her refuge, a place where she could imagine a life beyond endless chores and the condescending glares of those who reminded her daily that she had no family name to protect her. By her early teens, Dorcas was working as a domestic servant in a respectable household. Her days were long, filled with cooking, cleaning, and obeying the whims of her employers. Yet she did her work diligently, hoping that loyalty might one day earn her stability, perhaps even a chance to carve out a modest but honest future. She dreamed of saving enough to open a small millinery shop, or to marry a man who could see her worth beyond her orphan status. But in a world where a young woman's life was built on the fragile foundation of reputation, it only took a whisper to destroy everything. Dorcas's fall came not from any crime she committed, but from an accusation. A piece of jewelry had gone missing in the household where she served, and suspicion fell on her. She denied it with tears and passion, but her employers did not believe her. Whether out of prejudice toward her orphaned status or out of convenience in needing someone to blame, they dismissed her as a thief. In that instant, Dorcas's fragile security shattered. In 1830s America, especially in small towns, an accusation could follow a person forever. For a young servant girl, it meant the end of employment opportunities and the beginning of ostracism. Few were willing to hire someone with even the shadow of dishonesty attached to her name. Whether guilty or innocent mattered less than the stain of suspicion. Alone, shamed, and without resources, Dorcas faced a harsh reality. Society gave women of her class few options: marriage, servitude, or the streets. With no dowry, no family, and no recommendations, the first two paths were nearly impossible. The third, entering prostitution, was not a choice made out of desire but out of desperation. By the time she reached New York City, Dorcas had shed her old name. She reinvented herself as Helen Jewett, a name that carried sophistication and allure, hiding the wounds of her past. For many women in her position, reinvention was the only armor they had. Names were changed as easily as dresses, each new identity an attempt to outrun the shame that society had forced upon them. Becoming Helen was not simply about survival. It was also about control. If she was to be judged harshly regardless of her innocence, she would at least choose a path where she could command her own destiny, or so she believed. In New York, a city teeming with commerce, wealth, and hidden vices, prostitution was a thriving underground trade. Brothels flourished just blocks away from churches and banks, serving powerful men who condemned such women in public while seeking them out in secret. Helen stood apart from many in her profession. She cultivated an air of refinement, reading novels, writing letters, and holding conversations that revealed her intelligence. Clients were struck not just by her beauty, but by her wit. She was unlike the stereotype of the fallen woman society liked to imagine. And yet, for all her effort to rise above, she could never fully escape the label of outcast. The irony of her journey was clear. A girl cast aside for a theft she may never have committed found herself in a profession condemned as sinful, not because she lacked dignity or intelligence, but because society had given her no other path. The same society that had failed to protect her as an orphan now condemned her for surviving in the only way it allowed. Helen's life, even before its violent end, revealed a cruel hypocrisy. Respectable men who held positions of power sought her out under the cover of darkness, but would never acknowledge her worth in daylight. Neighbors who whispered about her immorality ignored the injustices that had pushed her into the life she lived. Her story was not just about one woman's fall, it was about the way an entire system abandoned women without wealth, family, or reputation. And yet, even as an outcast, Helen showed resilience. She refused to disappear into anonymity. She created a persona that commanded attention, proving that even those society tried to erase could find ways to assert their presence. Her intelligence, charm, and determination made her unforgettable, a quality that would later ensure her name lived on long after her tragic death. Her journey from orphan to outcast was not a story of moral weakness, but of survival in a world stacked against her. It exposed the harsh reality of 1830s America, where women were judged more by circumstance than by character. And it set the stage for the tragedy that would follow, a tragedy that would not only end her life, but force an entire nation to confront uncomfortable truths about gender, morality, and justice. When Dorcas Doyen arrived in New York City under her new name, Helen Jewett, she stepped into a world of contrasts. New York in the 1830s was a city of opportunity and danger, of glittering ballrooms and shadowed alleys. It was the beating heart of America's early Gilded Age, though the term would not be coined until later in the century, and it embodied all the contradictions of a society striving for wealth and respectability, while hiding its vices beneath a thin veil of morality. Helen understood this better than most. By necessity, she became a student of the city's hidden currents, learning quickly how power and pleasure intersected. While she lived in brothels and earned her living as a prostitute, she carried herself with a grace and refinement that distinguished her from many others in her trade. She was not simply a fallen woman. She was in many ways a self-made figure who shaped her own identity. Unlike many women forced into prostitution by poverty, Helen crafted a persona that was alluring and commanding. She dressed elegantly, styled her hair with care, and cultivated an air of sophistication. She read voraciously, filling her mind with stories, ideas, and words that impressed her clients. Men who visited her expecting only beauty found themselves equally captivated by her wit and charm. Some came back less for the services she offered and more for the companionship she provided. Intelligent conversation in a city where loneliness was common even among the wealthy. In her letters, which later became public, Helen revealed herself as articulate and thoughtful. She wrote with emotion, often appealing to the better nature of the men in her life, reminding them of the humanity beneath her profession. These letters, preserved through scandal, showed a woman who was aware of her precarious place in society, yet refused to let it define her entirely. But to the outside world, Helen was still an outcast. Prostitution was condemned as immoral, a sign of a woman's failure. What society refused to acknowledge, however, was its own complicity. Respectable men, lawyers, bankers, merchants, and even politicians were frequent visitors to the city's brothels. They sought women like Helen in secret while publicly denouncing them as sinful. The very men who condemned her kind ensured their survival through their patronage. This hypocrisy was the heart of Helen's double life. By day, she was invisible to respectable society, a woman to be shunned, whispered about, and judged. By night, she entertained men of wealth and influence who eagerly paid for her company. These same men returned to their families and their social circles without consequence, while Helen and women like her carried the full burden of shame. And yet, Helen wielded a kind of power within this hidden world. She chose her clients, often rejecting those she deemed unworthy or disrespectful. She charged higher fees than many others, reflecting the reputation she had built as one of the city's most refined courtesans. In a society that gave women little control, Helen carved out a space where she could exercise agency, however fragile it was. Still, that power was precarious. For all her elegance and intelligence, Helen could never cross fully into the world of respectability. She was admired in private but despised in public. She was, in essence, both desired and despised at once, celebrated for her allure but condemned for the very same. This duality mirrored the contradictions of New York itself. The city was booming with wealth, yet poverty was rampant. Churches preached morality, yet brothels flourished openly on its streets. The rich sought to build reputations of virtue while indulging their vices behind closed doors. Helen embodied this contradiction, a woman who should have been erased by shame, yet who thrived by exposing the hypocrisy of those around her. Some accounts even suggest that Helen dreamed of escaping the life she lived. She spoke of wanting to marry, of finding stability and respectability, but her past and her reputation made such dreams nearly impossible. In 1830s America, a woman once branded as a prostitute could not easily remake herself in the eyes of society. Reinvention was allowed for men, gamblers, drunkards, even criminals could rebuild their lives if they held status or wealth. For women, especially women like Helen, the door remained closed. Despite this, Helen refused to disappear into despair. She lived with boldness, creating a name that would not be forgotten. While society sought to erase women like her, Helen made herself unforgettable through her beauty, her writing, her presence, and, tragically, through her death. Her double life carried risks, however. By attracting wealthy and influential clients, Helen also entangled herself in relationships that were fraught with danger. Many men who visited her desired not only her company but also control over her. Some could not accept that she was both available to them and unattainable as a permanent possession. In this tension between desire and control, Helen's fate would eventually be sealed. But before that fatal night, her life as Helen Jewett stood as a quiet rebellion against the rigid boundaries society placed on women. She showed that intelligence, refinement, and ambition could exist even in those whom society dismissed as fallen. She revealed the hypocrisy of a culture that indulged in secret what it condemned in public. And she embodied resilience, a woman who, even as an outcast, insisted on living with dignity, charm, and wit. Her double life was not simply about survival. It was a mirror held up to the society around her, reflecting its contradictions, its hypocrisies, and its injustices. It is this duality, desired yet despised, intelligent yet condemned, empowered yet trapped, that makes Helen Jewett's story timeless. Her life reminds us that worth is not defined by social status, and that behind every label society imposes lies a human being with dreams, intelligence, and dignity. The spring of 1836 had brought a restless energy to New York City. The streets were alive with carriages, lamplight, and the hum of a city both expanding and fracturing. Brothels stood only blocks away from the homes of merchants and bankers, reminders of the contradictions woven into the fabric of urban life. In one such establishment, a house on Thomas Street, lived Helen Jewett, a woman admired by many, condemned by more, and destined for tragedy. April 10 began like any other night for Helen. She dressed carefully, as she always did, choosing a gown that reflected her taste for refinement. Unlike many women in her profession, Helen carried herself with an elegance that could rival any society hostess. She prepared to meet clients, among them a young man with whom she had become entangled, Richard Robinson, a 19-year-old clerk from a respectable Connecticut family. Robinson was handsome, educated, and ambitious, but he was also reckless. His relationship with Helen was complicated, part romance, part transaction, and part obsession. Though he publicly denied their closeness, letters suggested a deeper connection. Helen saw in him perhaps the possibility of something more than her precarious life offered. For Robinson, Helen represented both fascination and danger, a woman who captivated him, but also threatened the respectability he sought. That night, witnesses saw Robinson enter the brothel he had visited before, and no one thought much of it. Helen received him with her usual warmth, unaware that this night would be different. They spent time together in her room, a chamber adorned with small touches of beauty, a few books, delicate furnishings, and the air of a woman who longed to be remembered for more than her profession. But sometime after midnight, tragedy struck. Neighbors later recalled hearing a commotion, followed by the smell of smoke. When other women in the house rushed to Helen's room, they found a scene that would haunt them forever. Helen lay on her bed, her body horribly injured from blows to the head. Her attacker had struck with a hatchet, an instrument of both brutality and finality. As if violence alone were not enough, the bed and room had been set aflame, as though the killer hoped to erase the evidence. The flames, however, did not consume everything before help arrived. The fire was doused, but Helen's life was already gone. The discovery stunned everyone. Helen Jewett, the witty and elegant woman who had charmed so many, had been reduced in a single night to a victim of senseless violence. The women of the brothel wept over her, horrified not only at the cruelty of the act but at what it revealed. In the eyes of some men, women like Helen were disposable. Suspicion quickly fell on Richard Robinson. Witnesses placed him at the house that night, and circumstantial evidence including testimony from other boarders and even a cloak believed to be his pointed to him. When confronted, Robinson denied everything, insisting he had left the house before the crime occurred. He portrayed himself as a respectable young man being slandered by women of ill repute, but in the hours and days that followed, the city could not look away. News of Helen's murder spread rapidly, filling newspapers with lurid headlines. For many readers, it was their first introduction to the world of prostitution that quietly thrived alongside the city's respectable establishments. For others, it was a scandal that exposed the hypocrisy of young men who enjoyed the company of such women, yet discarded them without thought. The murder of Helen Jewett became more than a crime. It became a mirror for society. People debated not only the guilt or innocence of Robinson, but also the value of Helen's life. Was she merely a prostitute, unworthy of sympathy? Or was she, as others argued, a young woman destroyed by circumstances beyond her control, who deserved the same justice as any respectable victim? What made the tragedy so piercing was the humanity Helen had shown in life. She was not an anonymous figure. She was a woman with intelligence, charm, and aspirations. Her letters revealed her vulnerability, her longing for dignity, and her attempts to reach beyond the stigma of her profession. To many, her death was a symbol of how society failed women like her, quick to condemn, slow to protect. The night of April 10, 1836, was not just the night Helen Jewett died. It was the night New York confronted its own contradictions. The murder forced conversations about gender, morality, class, and justice. It blurred the line between private vice and public respectability, revealing a society eager to exploit women in secret while erasing their humanity in public. For the women who knew Helen personally, the grief was profound. She had been more than her profession. She had been a friend, a confidant, a woman of warmth and intelligence. Her absence left a void in their lives, and the violence of her death left them terrified for their own safety. If such a fate could befall Helen, what protection did any of them truly have? In the weeks that followed, as Robinson was arrested and prepared for trial, Helen's memory lingered in every newspaper column, every whispered conversation, every courtroom exchange. She could no longer speak for herself, but her story had begun to speak for countless women who lived in the margins, unseen and unprotected. The night of April 10, 1836, was a tragedy, but it was also a catalyst. It was the moment when one woman's death forced an entire city to confront questions it had long ignored. Helen Jewett's life ended violently, but her story was only beginning to shape how America would grapple with the rights, dignity, and humanity of women. When Helen Jewett's body was discovered on April 10, 1836, the entire city of New York seemed to gasp in collective shock. The brutality of the crime, the youth and beauty of the victim, and the respectability of the accused all combined to make the case unlike anything America had seen before. But it wasn't just the murder that captured the public's imagination, it was the trial that followed. For the first time, the American press covered a court case with the intensity and drama of a theatrical performance. What unfolded was not only a trial of Richard Robinson, but also a trial of society's conscience. Richard Robinson, just 19 years old, was not the kind of man most people expected to see charged with such a crime. He was a clerk from a respectable family, educated, ambitious, and handsome. To his peers, he represented the promise of the young American middle class. The idea that such a man could commit a savage murder and against a prostitute no less seemed unthinkable to many. From the beginning, the trial carried the weight of spectacle. Newspapers published every detail, from Helen Jewett's final hours to the most mundane facts of Robinson's daily life. Courtrooms were packed with spectators eager to watch. This was more than justice at work. It was entertainment, scandal, and social commentary all in one. The prosecution presented a case built on circumstantial evidence. Witnesses testified that Robinson had visited Helen on the night of the murder. Others swore they recognized his cloak, found near the scene, and linked him to the crime. Letters exchanged between Helen and Robinson suggested intimacy and a troubled relationship, but Robinson had advantages that Helen never did. He had powerful friends, wealthy backers, and skilled lawyers. His defense team argued that the evidence was flimsy, that the cloak could not be conclusively tied to him, and that the testimonies of prostitutes and brothel workers were unreliable by nature. The underlying message was clear. Robinson, as a respectable young man, was more trustworthy than any woman who lived in Helen's world. Perhaps the most painful part of the trial was the way Helen's life was dissected and demeaned in the courtroom. Instead of being remembered as a victim, she was painted as a temptress, a manipulator, and a woman unworthy of sympathy. The defense seized upon her profession as proof of her lack of credibility. They suggested that she was prone to lies, that her relationships were transactional, and that her accusations against Robinson, spoken in letters and conversations, were driven by jealousy or greed. In essence, Helen was put on trial alongside Robinson. The tragedy was not only that she had been murdered, but that even in death, her character was shredded to preserve the future of a man with social standing. After days of testimony and cross-examination, the jury reached its decision. Richard Robinson was acquitted. The verdict shocked some and relieved others. For many in the courtroom, it was proof of the double standard of justice. A young man of good family was given the benefit of every doubt, while a woman of questionable status was denied even the dignity of being considered a reliable victim. Robinson walked free, his reputation bruised but his future still intact. In contrast, Helen remained forever branded as a fallen woman whose death could not shake society's prejudices. Yet if the courtroom denied Helen justice, the newspapers gave her a form of immortality. The trial marked one of the first times American journalism covered a murder case with sensational daily reporting. Writers filled pages with vivid descriptions, letters, testimonies, and speculation. Some newspapers condemned Helen, echoing the arguments of the defense, but others portrayed her as a tragic figure, intelligent, witty, and ultimately betrayed by a hypocritical society. These competing narratives ensured that Helen Jewett would not be forgotten. She became a symbol not only of the dangers women faced, but also of the hypocrisy embedded in the so-called moral fabric of the era. The trial forced Americans to wrestle with difficult questions. Was justice truly blind, or did class and gender dictate outcomes? Could a prostitute be considered a credible victim, or was her very existence a stain that erased her humanity? For many reformers, Helen's case became a rallying point. Women's rights advocates pointed to the trial as evidence of systemic injustice. It highlighted the vulnerability of women who lived outside the protection of marriage and respectability, and it raised uncomfortable truths about men who indulged in vice while pretending to uphold virtue. The acquittal was not simply a legal failure, it was a moral one. It revealed how deeply prejudice shaped justice, and how society's condemnation of women could outweigh even the clearest evidence. Though acquitted, Robinson never fully escaped suspicion. He left New York seeking to rebuild his life elsewhere. For years, rumors followed him, whispers of the trial that had once consumed the city. He had escaped prison, but he could not entirely escape the shadow of Helen Jewett's murder. What made the trial unforgettable were Helen's letters, which were read in court and reprinted in the press. They revealed a woman of intelligence, passion, and humanity. Even as the courtroom sought to silence her, her words endured. Through her letters, Helen spoke beyond her death, demanding to be remembered not only as a prostitute, but as a woman with dreams, feelings, and dignity. The murder of Helen Jewett and the trial of Richard Robinson did not change the system overnight, but they planted seeds of awareness. They showed the public the stark inequality between men and women, rich and poor, respectable and outcast. They exposed the hypocrisy of a society that consumed women like Helen in secret while condemning them in public. The trial shook America not because justice was done, but because it wasn't. It forced the nation to look at itself in the mirror and see the contradictions it wanted to ignore. And in that reflection lay the beginnings of reform movements that would one day demand equality and justice for all. The spring of 1836 found New York City gripped by one of the most sensational criminal cases in its history. Newspapers carried the story of Helen Jewett's brutal murder, and the name of Richard Robinson, her alleged killer, was whispered in parlors, taverns, and street corners alike. But it wasn't merely a murder trial. It was a cultural event, a test of the justice system, and a moment when America's double standards about class, gender, and morality were laid bare. By the time Robinson's trial began in June 1836, the case had become a national obsession. The courtroom was packed each day, filled with lawyers, reporters, curious citizens, and even members of New York's elite, who came not only for justice but for spectacle. People treated the trial like a theater performance, lining up outside the courthouse to secure seats as if for a play. The judge presided with stern formality, but he could not control the charged atmosphere. Every word spoken by a witness was printed in newspapers across the country the following day. The murder of a prostitute might otherwise have been ignored, but Helen Jewett's intelligence, beauty, and tragic end, paired with Robinson's respectable background, gave the trial irresistible drama. The prosecution presented a straightforward case. Robinson had been seen at the brothel the night Helen was killed. A cloak believed to belong to him was found at the scene. Several witnesses testified that Robinson and Helen had a complicated relationship. Most damning of all, other women in the brothel insisted he was the last man seen entering her room before the fire broke out. Yet the defense countered with a strategy that revealed how justice in the 1830s often worked. They did not need to disprove every detail. They only needed to discredit the witnesses. Since nearly all of them were prostitutes or brothel workers, the defense argued that their testimony was inherently unreliable. Respectable men, the lawyers suggested, could not be condemned based on the word of women who lived in vice. Robinson's lawyers further insisted the evidence was circumstantial. Cloaks were common, they said. The one found near the scene could not be definitively tied to him. They painted their client as a promising young man being dragged down by scandalous women and opportunistic prosecutors. Helen herself could not testify, but her letters, which had been preserved and presented in court, gave her a kind of posthumous presence. In her writing, Helen came across as articulate, romantic, and even vulnerable. She expressed affection for Robinson while also voicing frustration at his coldness and duplicity. For some readers of the newspapers, these letters humanized her. For others, they only reinforced the defense's portrait of her as manipulative. What should have been evidence of her humanity became another battlefield for society's prejudices. As the trial proceeded, it became clear that Robinson's class and social standing carried as much weight as the evidence itself. The jury, all men, all from the same society that condemned prostitutes while protecting respectable youth, was reluctant to convict. The defense's closing arguments drove home a message that was as much moral as legal. Would the jury really destroy the life of a young clerk with a bright future based on the accusations of women's society already dismissed as immoral? The implication was unmistakable. Helen's life was worth less, her testimony unreliable even in death. When the verdict came, the words reverberated beyond the courtroom, "Not guilty." Richard Robinson was acquitted. He walked free, his future preserved, while Helen lay in her grave, her reputation tarnished even further by the spectacle. The verdict was a relief to Robinson's family and friends, but it left many others outraged. How could so much evidence be brushed aside? How could a woman's murder be excused simply because of her profession? For reformers, the trial was proof of what they already knew, that justice was not blind, but tilted in favor of class, gender, and respectability. If the courtroom denied Helen justice, the press gave her a strange kind of immortality. Newspapers had covered trials before, but never with such intensity. Reporters printed nearly every word spoken, and entire communities followed the case as if it were serialized drama. Some papers condemned Helen, calling her manipulative and immoral. Others painted her as a victim of hypocrisy and cruelty. For the first time, a prostitute was at the center of a national conversation about morality, justice, and gender. The trial showed the growing power of the press to shape public opinion and to give voice to people who would otherwise have been silenced. The trial was more than the story of one murder. It was a mirror reflecting society's contradictions. On one hand, men like Robinson enjoyed the company of women like Helen in secret. On the other, they condemned those same women publicly. The legal system, instead of protecting the vulnerable, reinforced their marginalization. Helen's story revealed a painful truth that in 1830s America, a woman's worth in the eyes of the law depended not on her humanity, but on her respectability. A respectable woman's murder might have brought swift justice. A prostitute's murder, however, was seen through a lens of suspicion and disdain. Though Robinson was acquitted, he never fully escaped the shadow of the trial. Whispers followed him wherever he went. He may have been free in the eyes of the law, but the court of public opinion remained divided. Meanwhile, Helen's name lingered in print and conversation, refusing to be erased. For many reformers and thinkers of the time, Helen became a tragic symbol not only of a life cut short, but of a system that refused to value women equally. Her death and the trial that followed ignited debates about women's rights, morality, and the double standards of justice. The trial of Richard Robinson shook America not because justice was done, but because justice was denied. It forced people to ask uncomfortable questions about the value of human life, the fairness of the courts, and the hypocrisy of a society that condemned women for sins it happily consumed in secret. Helen Jewett's tragedy was not just a story of violence. It was a story of systemic failure, of prejudice dressed as justice, and yet, by refusing to fade from memory, it also became a story of resilience. Through the press, through reformers, and through history itself, Helen's voice continued to echo, challenging each new generation to build a society where justice truly sees all as equal. The murder of Helen Jewett and the acquittal of Richard Robinson left New York shaken. For weeks after the trial, her name filled newspaper columns and lingered in conversations from drawing rooms to taverns. Yet beyond the lurid fascination with the crime, the case revealed a deeper truth, one that still resonates today. Helen's story was not just about violence, it was about the way society chose to measure human worth and how hypocrisy often eclipsed humanity. The trial exposed one of the most glaring double standards of the 1830s. Men of status could slip easily between respectable society and the shadowy world of brothels without lasting consequence. Their indiscretions were seen as youthful folly or private weakness, easily forgiven if not entirely ignored. Women, however, bore the weight of lifelong condemnation. Once branded a prostitute, a woman could never escape that identity in the eyes of the public. No amount of intelligence, refinement, or kindness could redeem her reputation. Helen's letters revealed a woman of sensitivity and wit, but in court they were twisted into evidence of manipulation. Her humanity was acknowledged only when it served the convenience of others. The hypocrisy was unmistakable. Men consumed the services of women like Helen in secret, then condemned those same women as immoral in public. They demanded intimacy while denying dignity. It was not simply unfair, it was dehumanizing. In the Gilded Age, respectability was a form of currency more valuable than money. It determined whether a person's voice carried weight, whether their suffering was acknowledged, and whether their rights were protected. Richard Robinson's acquittal was not just the result of clever lawyering. It was the result of a system that valued his respectability more than Helen's life. The jury, composed entirely of men, could not imagine equating the word of prostitutes with that of a clerk from a good family. To them, convicting Robinson would have been a betrayal of the very social order they upheld. The tragedy was not only that Helen died violently, but that in death her worth was weighed against the comfort of a young man's future, and she was found wanting. This revealed an uncomfortable truth about society then. Justice was not blind. It had eyes wide open to class, gender, and reputation. Yet Helen's story also revealed something else, that humanity persists even in the margins where society seeks to erase it. The women who lived and worked alongside her remembered her as more than her profession. They recalled her intelligence, her humor, her warmth. Her letters, published and debated across the country, showed a woman who longed for love and stability, who dreamed of being seen as more than an object of desire. In these fragments, Helen forced people to confront the uncomfortable reality that prostitutes were not nameless, faceless figures. They were human beings, daughters, friends, women with hopes and fears. Her death made it impossible for society to continue pretending otherwise. Helen's murder and the trial that followed served as a harsh lesson in the consequences of prejudice. When society decides that some lives are worth less than others, injustice thrives. Robinson was acquitted not because the evidence exonerated him, but because the victim's identity gave the jury permission to doubt. Prejudice provided the defense as much as any legal argument did. This prejudice extended beyond the courtroom. Some newspapers described Helen as a dangerous temptress who had brought her fate upon herself. Others dismissed her entirely, focusing instead on Robinson's bright future. To them, Helen was a cautionary tale, not a victim. Such narratives reinforced the dangerous belief that certain lives were expendable. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Helen's story is the role hypocrisy plays in sustaining injustice. Society indulged in the very practices it condemned. Men visited brothels in the dark while attending church in the morning. They demanded purity from women while excusing their own transgressions. The hypocrisy was not a minor flaw, it was the foundation of a system that allowed men like Robinson to walk free. Hypocrisy does more than hide truth, it erodes justice. It blinds people to suffering, excuses cruelty, and sustains inequality. In Helen's case, hypocrisy turned a murder trial into a performance designed not to uncover truth, but to preserve appearances. Yet out of this injustice grew seeds of change. Reformers, journalists, and early advocates for women's rights seized upon Helen's story as proof that society needed to confront its contradictions. They argued that justice could not be truly just if it depended on reputation rather than humanity. They demanded that women, even those marginalized by circumstance, deserved protection and dignity. Though change was slow, Helen's case remained a touchstone in conversations about morality, gender, and justice. It pushed people to question whether a society that so easily dismissed the lives of its most vulnerable could ever call itself moral. Nearly 2 centuries later, the lessons of Helen Jewett's life and death remain urgent. Her story reminds us to look critically at the ways society still assigns worth unevenly. Who gets believed in courtrooms today? Whose voices are dismissed because of poverty, background, or reputation? How often do we condemn in public what we consume in private? Helen's life forces us to confront these questions, not out of morbid fascination, but out of a duty to ensure that injustice born of prejudice is not repeated. Her tragedy teaches that humanity must never be conditional, and dignity must never depend on status. At its heart, Helen Jewett's story is a plea to choose humanity over hypocrisy. It is a reminder that justice must not be selective, that compassion must not be rationed according to class or gender, and that no person should be denied dignity because of the labels society assigns them. Helen did not live to see such lessons take root, but her story, preserved through newspapers, letters, and history, continues to speak across generations. She remains a symbol not of shame, but of resilience, reminding us that truth and justice require us to confront our hypocrisies and extend our humanity to all. Helen Jewett's life ended violently on that April night in 1836, but her story did not vanish with the smoke that filled her room. In many ways, her death was only the beginning of a conversation America could no longer avoid. She had lived on the margins of respectability, dismissed by some as fallen. Yet in death, she became a symbol of injustice, of resilience, and of the urgent need for society to see humanity where it often chose not to. The legacy of Helen Jewett is not confined to history books. It still speaks to us, reminding us of the power of truth, the danger of hypocrisy, and the enduring need for dignity. Much of the outrage following Helen's murder stemmed from the way she was treated in court and in the press. She was not remembered first as a daughter or a friend, but as a prostitute. That label, wielded like a weapon, was meant to strip her of dignity and humanity. Yet, despite attempts to reduce her to a stereotype, Helen refused to be erased. Her letters, her wit, her presence in the lives of those who knew her, all of these painted a portrait of a complex woman who deserved to be seen in full. Her legacy motivates us to look beyond labels. Whether someone is dismissed because of poverty, profession, background, or past mistakes, Helen's story reminds us that every person carries within them a story worth hearing. She was not simply a fallen woman. She was a reader, a writer, a dreamer, a survivor. And in remembering her this way, we are challenged to see others in our own time with the same depth. Helen's death also fueled reform movements that sought to confront the very hypocrisies her case exposed. In the years that followed, conversations about women's rights, sexual double standards, and the treatment of prostitutes gained traction. Some early women's rights advocates pointed to Helen's case as evidence of why women needed not only legal protections, but also social respect. Though reforms came slowly, the outrage surrounding her trial was a spark. It showed that even those society sought to silence could force their way into the national conscience. Helen's legacy is a lesson in how tragedy, when confronted honestly, can become a catalyst for change. What made Helen's story endure was not just the crime itself, but the way it was told. Newspapers carried her name across the nation, sparking debates in homes and communities that might otherwise never have discussed issues like gender equality or prostitution. Her letters, preserved and published, gave her a voice that even death could not silence. This is part of her motivational legacy, the recognition that stories matter. They have the power to challenge prejudice, to stir empathy, and to inspire reform. Helen Jewett's story was uncomfortable, scandalous, even controversial, but it was also transformative. Today, it reminds us that sharing stories of injustice is one of the most powerful ways to demand change. At the heart of Helen's legacy lies a warning: hypocrisy corrodes justice. The men who visited her in secret condemned her in public. The jurors who acquitted Robinson valued his reputation over her life. The society that consumed women like Helen erased their humanity when it became inconvenient. Her story motivates us to examine our own hypocrisies. How often do we condemn in public what we indulge in private? How often do we excuse the powerful while punishing the vulnerable? Helen's case shows the damage this double standard causes not only to individuals, but to the moral fabric of society itself. Despite her hardships, Helen lived with resilience. She reinvented herself after being falsely accused of theft as a teenager. She built a life in New York that, while precarious, was marked by refinement and dignity. She read widely, wrote passionately, and carried herself with confidence in a world that tried to diminish her. Her resilience, even in the face of prejudice, is part of what makes her story motivational. She teaches us that we are not defined solely by the labels society gives us. We can carve out spaces of dignity even in harsh conditions. We can assert our humanity even when others try to deny it. Helen's story continues to resonate because the questions it raised have not disappeared. Who gets believed in a courtroom, whose voices are dismissed because of background or reputation? How do we treat those who live on the margins of society? Her legacy motivates us to confront these questions in our own time. It pushes us to build systems that are truly just, where a person's worth is not determined by respectability, but by humanity. It challenges us to look beyond stereotypes, to dismantle prejudice, and to extend dignity to those too often silenced. Helen Jewett did not live to see justice, but her story has lived on to teach us that justice is not simply about verdicts, it is about the values we hold as a society. Her death revealed the hypocrisy of her age, but her life revealed something stronger, the persistence of humanity even in the harshest conditions. Her legacy is a call to action. It asks us to honor the humanity of those dismissed by society, to confront the hypocrisies in our own lives, and to use stories of injustice as fuel for reform. Helen Jewett's tragedy is undeniable, but so too is her impact. She forces us to see that dignity must never be conditional, and that humanity must never be denied.